Chapter 4. Chapter 4. A New Era of Resistance and Adaptation. As the United States teetered on the edge of collapse, its citizens found themselves forced to adapt in ways they had never imagined. The old systems, the ones that had once provided a sense of stability and structure, had crumbled, leaving millions to fend for themselves. With the public sector gutted and corporate control tightening its grip, many believed that survival would come only to those who could navigate this new, fractured America with cunning and resilience. But something unexpected began to happen. Instead of succumbing to despair, the people fought back, not in the ways the ruling class expected, not through violence, but through innovation, unity, and a radical reimagining of society itself. This was the birth of a new era, one defined by resistance and adaptation. The collapse of the old guard. For decades, Americans had been conditioned to rely on large institutions, corporations, banks, government agencies, for their livelihoods. These entities had long positioned themselves as the backbone of society, but by 2025, their true nature had been exposed. The economic elite had always profited from instability, manipulating markets, policies, and the workforce to consolidate power. But when they took things too far, when they wiped out millions of jobs in the public sector, privatized basic services, and squeezed workers to the breaking point, they miscalculated one crucial factor: the people's capacity for reinvention. Communities, left with no alternative, began breaking free from the systems that had enslaved them. The reliance on major corporations for employment, healthcare, education, and financial stability started to wane as people found ways to provide for themselves and each other. A shift towards self-sufficiency. The first and most immediate adaptation came in the form of self-sufficiency. In the absence of government aid and corporate employment, people turned to the most basic principle of survival. They helped one another. In cities and rural towns alike, underground economies flourished. Communities built their own networks for food production, education, and healthcare. Abandoned lots became urban gardens. Medical professionals, ousted from a healthcare system that prioritized profits over patients, set up makeshift clinics. Engineers and tradespeople taught others how to repair homes, build alternative energy sources, and create sustainable infrastructure. Bartering replaced traditional currency in many places as trust in banks eroded. Goods and services were exchanged without the interference of financial institutions, which had long profited from debt and economic dependence. Cryptocurrencies and decentralized finance gained traction, offering an alternative to the manipulated stock markets and government-controlled monetary systems. Those who had spent their lives tethered to an office, following the rigid structure of corporate employment, found themselves learning new skills: gardening, carpentry, mechanics, digital commerce, anything that would allow them to survive without relying on the crumbling institutions of the past. The rise of underground education and skill sharing. With public education defunded and universities transformed into luxury institutions for the ultra-wealthy, the working class took matters into their own hands. Unregulated, community-led learning centers, often held in abandoned schools, basements, and online forums, emerged across the country. These were not the traditional classrooms of the past. They were places where knowledge was shared freely, tailored to practical survival and resistance. People learned coding and cybersecurity to protect themselves from digital surveillance. They studied finance to outmaneuver predatory lenders and landlords. They were trained in legal defense strategies to fight back against unjust evictions and arrests. Trade skills, plumbing, electrical work, construction, became as valuable as college degrees once had been, equipping individuals with the ability to sustain themselves in their communities. The new education system was built on empowerment, not compliance. It was no longer about fitting into a system designed to exploit, but about dismantling that system altogether. The formation of worker cooperatives and collectives. The labor force, long exploited under the illusion of job security, began rejecting the traditional employer-employee relationship. In its place, worker-owned cooperatives and independent trade networks took root. Instead of competing for scraps in an economy designed to keep wages low and profits high, workers banded together, pooling resources to create businesses that they themselves controlled. Food distribution networks bypassed grocery store chains. Independent manufacturers crafted clothing, furniture, and tools without relying on major retailers. Even the tech sector saw a shift, as programmers and engineers built decentralized platforms that could not be controlled by corporate overlords. Without CEOs and shareholders skimming profits off the top, these cooperatives thrived. They provided fair wages, equitable working conditions, and an economy that benefited the people who actually did the work, not those who had spent decades exploiting them. Digital resistance and the fight for free information. As corporate-backed lawmakers cracked down on protests and dissent, a new battlefield emerged: the digital world. Information had always been power, and those in control sought to suppress it. Censorship laws tightened, social media platforms were monitored more aggressively, and whistleblowers were silenced. The mainstream news, long influenced by corporate interests, continued pushing narratives that favored the elite, portraying the resistance as dangerous radicals rather than ordinary citizens fighting for their survival. But the resistance was smarter. Hackers, independent journalists, and digital activists used encrypted networks to share real news, exposing corruption and corporate influence. Private communication apps allowed organizers to coordinate without fear of surveillance. Open-source platforms replaced mainstream social media, ensuring that the people, not corporations, controlled the flow of information. The internet, once a tool of oppression, became a weapon for liberation. The emergence of parallel societies. By the end of 2025, two Americas existed side by side. One was the America of the elite, the skyscrapers, private clubs, luxury compounds, and boardrooms where decisions were made in secret. An America where the few who had retained wealth and influence continued to live as though the country were not crumbling around them. The other was the America of the people, the underground networks, the barter-based economies, the worker-owned collectives, and the self-sustaining communities that had adapted to a system designed to crush them. This was the true resistance, not an army, not a political party, but a movement of people who refused to be controlled, a movement of workers, thinkers, builders, and dreamers who knew that if the American dream was to survive, it would have to be rebuilt by those who had been denied it for so long. The fight was far from over. The elite still held the reins of power, and they would not surrender control easily, but the people had something more powerful than wealth or influence. They had each other, and that was something no corporation, no billionaire, and no government could ever take away. Chapter 5. The Political Awakening. For decades, politics in America had been little more than theater. Candidates made grand promises, debates played out like rehearsed performances, and elections felt more like a ritual than a genuine contest for power. The decisions that shaped the nation were not made by the people, but by a small elite. Corporate executives, billionaires, and politicians whose loyalty was not to the voters, but to the donors who financed their campaigns. The average citizen had become a spectator in their own democracy, a bystander watching helplessly as the wealth gap widened, as corruption deepened, as the system crumbled under its own greed. But in 2025, something changed. The economic devastation brought by mass layoffs, corporate overreach, and the blatant disregard for human dignity had ignited something long dormant in the American people. It was not just anger, though anger burned hot in every displaced worker, every evicted family, every overworked and underpaid laborer. It was something more powerful than rage. It was realization, a realization that the system had never been broken, it had been designed this way, that the suffering of the many was not an accident, but a carefully maintained balance to keep the powerful in control. That democracy, as it stood, was an illusion, a mirage that masked the machinery of oligarchy. For the first time in generations, the people understood that they had been complicit, not through action, but through inaction. By staying silent, by voting for the lesser evil, by believing that their voices did not matter, and now they were ready to reclaim their power. The rise of a new political consciousness. The first signs of change came at the ballot box. Voter participation surged, but not in the ways political analysts had predicted. The old parties, the establishment-backed Democrats and Republicans, found themselves hemorrhaging support as the people sought out alternatives. Candidates who had once been dismissed as unelectable, those who refused corporate donations, who spoke of radical change rather than minor reform, suddenly found themselves at the center of a growing movement. Independents, grassroots activists, and community organizers began winning local elections, their campaigns fueled not by billionaire funding, but by small-dollar donations and sheer, unrelenting determination. For the first time in decades, politics felt real, and those in power panicked. The battle for control. The establishment had spent years perfecting its strategies for maintaining control, and it deployed them with ruthless efficiency. First came the smear campaigns. Independent candidates were labeled as extremists, radicals, or worse. News outlets owned by corporate interests painted them as dangerous, unqualified, or naive. Social media platforms suppressed their messages, using algorithms to drown out voices that challenged the status quo. When that failed, voter suppression tactics escalated. ID laws were tightened, polling stations in working-class neighborhoods mysteriously closed, and mail-in ballots became the subject of endless legal battles. In some areas, elections themselves were contested, with results delayed or overturned under questionable circumstances. But despite every attempt to subdue them, the people refused to be silenced. From protest to organized resistance. As faith in electoral politics wavered, the movement found strength elsewhere. In the streets, in workplaces, in the power of collective action. Protests that had once been dismissed as disorganized outbursts of frustration evolved into carefully coordinated demonstrations. Unions, long weakened by corporate lobbying, found new life as workers realized their greatest weapon was not in their individual votes, but in their ability to shut down the economy itself. Truck drivers halted shipments, paralyzing supply chains. Teachers staged nationwide walkouts, refusing to educate students in a system that had been gutted by budget cuts. Healthcare workers, exhausted by years of exploitation, refused to clock in at hospitals that prioritized profits over lives. The ruling class responded with force. Censorship laws tightened, making it illegal to spread what they deemed anti-government rhetoric. Protesters were met with militarized police forces, their demonstrations labeled as riots regardless of their peaceful intent. Leaders of the movement were arrested on fabricated charges, silenced before their influence could spread. But the government's heavy-handed tactics only fueled the fire. The more they tried to suppress the movement, the more people joined it. The brutality of the system was no longer hidden. It was on full display, broadcast in real time for the world to see. And with every act of repression, the question shifted. No longer was it about reform. No longer was it about fixing the system. It was about whether the system should be torn down altogether. The crossroads of a nation. By the end of 2025, America stood at a crossroads. The government, once confident in its ability to suppress dissent, now found itself facing an opponent it could not intimidate, a population that had lost its fear. The people no longer believed in the myth of stability, no longer clung to the idea that things would return to normal. The battle for the soul of the country was underway. Would the old guard cling to power through force, dragging the nation into authoritarianism? Or would the people succeed in building something new, a democracy that truly served its citizens rather than the corporate elite? The answer had yet to be written. But one thing was certain. The American people were no longer spectators. They were ready to fight for their future. Chapter 6. The Rebirth of the American Dream. For decades, the American dream had been a promise woven into the very fabric of the nation. It was the idea that hard work, perseverance, and ambition would lead to prosperity. A home, a stable job, a future better than the one inherited from the previous generation. It was the belief that anyone, regardless of background, could rise above their circumstances and build a life of security and success. But by 2025, that dream had become a cruel illusion. The pathways to prosperity had been barricaded by those at the top. The corporate elite had transformed the economy into a rigged game, one where the rules ensured that wealth remained in the hands of a privileged few, while the majority struggled to survive. The middle class, once the backbone of the country, had been hollowed out. Home ownership was a fantasy for all but the wealthy, wages were stagnant, and entire industries had been automated or outsourced, leaving millions without work. For years, the people had watched as their futures were stolen from them. But now, something had shifted. The American people had finally come to a realization. The American dream was not dead, it had been taken, and they were ready to take it back. A new definition of success. In the ashes of the old system, a new vision of success began to emerge. One not built on the outdated ideals of wealth accumulation, corporate prestige, and consumerism, but on something deeper, more meaningful. For many, success was no longer about climbing a corporate ladder that had been dismantled before they could even reach the first rung. It was no longer about chasing a six-figure salary in an economy that refused to pay a living wage. The people had stopped measuring success by the standards imposed on them by those who had never lived a day in their shoes. Instead, success became about community. It became about resilience. It became about breaking free from a system that had never been designed to benefit them in the first place. Families who had been forced out of cities due to rising costs built self-sustaining communities in rural areas, growing their own food, generating their own energy, and trading goods and services in local economies that bypassed corporate control. Cities, once centers of wealth inequality, became hubs of worker-owned cooperatives, where employees had a direct stake in their businesses and shared in their profits rather than funneling them to a faceless board of executives. Knowledge, once hoarded by elite institutions and sold at a price only the wealthy could afford, was now freely exchanged. Community learning centers, independent trade schools, and decentralized online education flourished, giving people the skills they needed to thrive in the new world they were creating. People no longer looked to politicians, corporations, or billionaires to shape their future. They had realized that the only ones who could build a better life were themselves. The rise of a new generation of leaders. It was not the Ivy League graduates, the CEOs, or the career politicians who led this new movement. It was the workers, the teachers, the laborers, the artists, the farmers, the single parents, the small business owners. The ones who had been dismissed, undervalued, and exploited for so long were now the ones shaping the future. They rejected the idea that power should belong to the few. They built systems where wealth was shared, where decision-making was democratic, where success was defined not by individual accumulation, but by collective prosperity. They were not just rebuilding their own lives, they were laying the foundation for a new America, one where opportunity was not dictated by privilege, where justice was not reserved for the wealthy, and where freedom was not just an empty slogan, but a lived reality. The resistance of the old guard, but the ruling class was not willing to relinquish control so easily. The billionaires, the corporate executives, the political elite, they saw what was happening, and they were afraid. The people were no longer afraid of them. They had stopped believing in the myths that had kept them complacent for so long. They had realized that the real power had always been in their hands. And so, the elite did what they had always done when their authority was threatened. They fought back. Laws were passed to criminalize worker cooperatives and independent trade networks. Regulations were tightened to make it nearly impossible for small businesses to compete. The media, owned by the same billionaires who had rigged the system, painted the movement as dangerous, radical, a threat to national stability. Police forces, once tasked with protecting communities, were mobilized to break up protests, raid community hubs, and intimidate organizers. Digital surveillance intensified, tracking those who dared to challenge the status quo. But the people had seen too much. They had suffered too much. There was no turning back. The battle for the future. The fight for the American dream was no longer about trying to restore the old way of life. That world was gone. It had been destroyed by those who had placed profits over people, greed over justice, and power over democracy. The fight was now about something greater, about creating a new vision of America, one that truly belonged to the people. It was a battle that would be fought in workplaces, in town halls, in city streets, in digital spaces. It was a battle of ideas, of resilience, of courage. And though the forces of the old world would not give up easily, neither would the people. The American dream was no longer something to be handed down from those in power. It was something to be fought for. It was something to be rebuilt. And this time, it would belong to everyone.